Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the South Dakota State Fair and the Dakota Land stage as we are getting ready to have the candidates debate for South Dakota Public Utilities Commission, and we'll run down some of the ground rules here in just a moment. Every candidate will have the opportunity 3 minutes to give an introduction. At the close, they will have 3 minutes to make closing remarks. Questions will be 2 minutes. The candidates will have 2 minutes to respond to the questions. We will also have the opportunity for you to ask questions of the candidates as well, so make yourself known. There will be people running around. They'll have some cards. You can write down your questions, and we want to get as many questions from you because these are the people who will be representing you on the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission. In addition to that, candidates will alternate in the questions asked based on how they begin their statements today. My name is Zach Nelson. I'm the news director at Performance Radio here in Huron, South Dakota. So welcome to Huron, and I think we are just about ready to get going. Randomly drawn is how the candidates were selected to go first, and we begin with the candidates for the 4-year term on the PUC. We have Chris Nelson and Nick Nemec. Over to my left, the candidates for the 6-year spot on the PUC, Matt McGovern, Russell Clark, and Christy Fegan. So we will start over here with Mr. Nemec.
Thank you, Zach. My name is Nick Nemec. I'm a farmer in Hyde County. I've been farming in Hyde County for 29 years. Last month, I got out of the Marine Corps in 1983, and I've been farming in Hyde County ever since. I've even got tan lines to prove it. There's my experience right there. The reason why I got into this race, the primary reason why I got into this race is because in Redfield, South Dakota, there was a seed company up there called Anderson Seeds that went belly up and cost farmers $2.6 million in unpaid product that they delivered to that plant. Now I have a plan where we can make those farmers whole. Every year in the state of South Dakota, we raise approximately 1 billion bushels of grain. A 1 penny checkoff on grain in the state of South Dakota could raise $10 million in 1 year's time. In 1 quarter, we could raise enough money to make those farmers whole for that grain that was stolen from them when Anderson Seeds went bankrupt. Now, a lot of people don't like. A lot of farmers don't like a checkoff. They don't want anybody to have their hands into their check any more than they have to. But the way I look at this is, this would be a checkoff that would be implemented only when necessary and would only be kept in place for the absolute minimum time necessary to raise the funds required to pay off the farmers. In this case, it could be done in 3 months' time. Now, like I said, there's a lot of people who have complaints about a checkoff. The way I look at it is, if I'm from out on the prairie, and if there's a prairie fire burning down through the countryside, everybody in the country drops what they're doing and they go to fight that prairie fire. Last summer, I had a neighbor who got deathly ill. He was near death. He was in the hospital for weeks, and then he was laid up at home for the rest of the summer. All the neighbors got together and put his feed up for him so that he was able to have feed for his cattle for that winter. And that's just the way that we do it. We take care of our own, we take care of our neighbors, and if the bonding cannot be enough to pay off those farmers, then the farmers of the state of South Dakota would chip in and help their neighbors so that nobody got stuck in the case of a bankruptcy like that. Thank you.
And Chris Nelson.
Thank you. I'd like, first of all, thank the Farmers Union, South Dakota Rural Electric for sponsoring this debate. You know, I think back to when I was in high school and college and I was planning to come to the state fair, I would purposely pick debate day to come to the fair because I enjoyed that political discourse. Never thought that I'd have the opportunity to participate in it, and today is that opportunity, and I appreciate that. For those of you that don't know me, just a little bit of my background. I grew up a farm ranch kid near White Lake. Grew to love agriculture, was elected state secretary of the Future Farmers of America in high school, went off to South Dakota State University, majored in animal science, intended to farm and ranch for my life's profession, but got a very unexpected job offer to go work in state government when I graduated from college. And so I went to Pierre, worked in state government, and at the same time I farmed and ranched with my dad for a number of years. And then in 2002, was elected Secretary of State for South Dakota, served a couple of terms there. And then in 2010, when I was term limited out as Secretary of State, I was planning again to probably go back into farming and ranching, and then had the most amazing surprise of my life when Governor Dugard called and said, there's going to be a vacancy on the PUC. Would you at all be interested in serving the people in that capacity? And I said yes to that for two reasons. First of all, I've grown to love serving the people of South Dakota, helping people solve their problems. And secondly, I love challenges. And the PUC is a place that deals with tremendous challenges these days. There are challenges coming at us in the utility field, primarily from Environmental Protection Agency regulations coming out of Washington that are pushing up electricity rates in South Dakota. We have challenges in the telecommunications area, primarily coming from FCC orders that are again pushing up telephone rates in rural America and slowing down broadband expansion in this state. And then, as Nick has talked about, we have challenges in the area of grain buyers and grain warehouses. And those are challenges that need to be met. Ladies and gentlemen, I love dealing with challenges, and I've had the opportunity over the last year and a half to aggressively learn about the utility industry, and I'm anxious to continue putting that experience to work for you as we deal with these challenges in the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll move over here to my left, and we will begin with Mr. Russell Clark.
Hi, I would like to first thank the South Dakota Farmers Union and the State Fair for hosting this event. In fact, moderating, thank you very much. You'll get to hear a whole bunch of different voices and different viewpoints, and I think that's real important for everyone who has an interest in voting in South Dakota. My name is Russ Clark, and I am a candidate for the PUC from the Libertarian Party. For those of you who don't know too much about the Libertarian Party, we're about 40 years old, and our philosophy is best summed up with our motto, which is minimum government, maximum freedom. As many of you are aware, the PUC is charged by the people of South Dakota with overseeing the regulation of utilities like energy, which has been talked about, like grain warehouses, railroads, telecommunications. What the PUC does over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years is going to have an enormous impact. South Dakota continues to grow. When we talk about energy, most of the people out there think about oil, natural gas, coal, and it's time to start maybe looking at alternative energies, what we can do as a commission, what we can do as a state to move that forward. Another really important part about energy is thinking about climate change. Other states and countries have done something about climate change, have looked into it, have decided that they as governments are going to do something about it. In the PUC and as citizens of the state, we're going to have to decide what role government has, if any, in this major debate and major change in our life. Telecommunications has been talked about. Most people think about the wireless technology. Just think about how that has grown and expanded over the past 10 years. It's stunning. Now, we don't do too much with wireless technology, but telecommunications companies in South Dakota, we have to facilitate communication between those companies and between the people and the industry itself. And we must also remember the Native American telecommunication industry and make sure they have equal footing in the state. When we're talking about grain, which has been referred to several times and will be again and again, it's probably not the sexiest thing to talk about, but it's one of the most important for South Dakota. So these are the things we're going to have to concentrate on. Just a little bit about me. I'm originally from the East Coast. I went to school in Iowa, in Virginia, met my wife, taught a little at Ball State University, and she finally convinced me to move home to South Dakota, where we spent the last 19 years raising our 2 sons. And I want to thank everyone up here for giving me the opportunity, and I hope you enjoy this.
All right, thank you very much. We'll move now to Ms. Christy Fegan.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you also for the South Dakota Rural Electric Cooperatives and the Farmers Union for bringing this debate forward. I think it's always great for citizens to meet their candidates so they know when they go to the ballot box on November 6th. First of all, a little bit of background about me. I absolutely love fairs. I have been at fairs since I've been very, very young. I was in 4-H when I could absolutely be in 4-H. I kept on asking my mom, when am I old enough to be in 4-H? I showed beef cattle, and actually my nephew's back there and he's showing beef cattle tomorrow. My niece is showing today, yesterday, and tomorrow. And so I have absolutely farming in my background, and I love being at fairs. I grew up on a farm near Chancellor, South Dakota. My father was a farmer. My mother was a schoolroom teacher. I had 4 older siblings, 3 older brothers. And my brother back here actually helped me show cattle. And then I went to, after graduating from Parker High School, I went to SDSU. And I graduated with the Ag Business degree and a double major in commercial economics. I first worked for Monsanto Chemical Company and was trained in South Dakota, but then they shipped me to Illinois. And after about a year, I was ready to come back to South Dakota. So for the past 27 years, I've had the privilege of having statewide type of positions that had the entire state as my territory. So for the last 17 years, I've ran the Junior Achievement Organization as their president, working with people from the north to the south and working with 21 boards across the state, educating 44,000 students about entrepreneurship, about business skills, and personal finance, and making sure they were ready for the working world when they got out of school. So my husband and my 2 children are not here. I have a nephew getting married today. I'll probably make the wedding dance, but they're at the wedding near Renner, South Dakota. But there's 3 things about the PUC Commission I want you to know that I bring to the PUC Commission. First of all, I bring a voice, a consumer voice. Because consumers need to be heard. Farmers, it affects every decision we make, affects farmers, affects ranchers, affects citizens, affects our pocketbooks. Number 2, I want to make sure the FCC doesn't do something to rural South Dakota that makes us go backwards. In their order that they sent us on November 11th, 752 pages, stopped broadband expansion across our state. And number 3, I want to make sure that we have common sense in government. And the EPA has certainly put on a lot of regulations in a very short time frame. And we all want clean energy. But we want the EPA to be reasonable in their rules and regulation. And 80% of the time you turn on, or about 60 to 70% of the time you turn on the lights, it's from coal fire. And they're being under attack. So I want to make sure that we listen to you, we advocate for you, and we consume for you. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And lastly, with opening remarks, Matt McGovern.
I want to thank the South Dakota Farmers Union and the South Dakota Rural Electric Association for organizing this debate today. I'm Matt McGovern. I'm running because we need commissioners who will stand up for consumers and farmers, not the utilities the PUC regulates. And I'm going to be an independent voice in Pierre because I'm the only candidate that's pledged not to take contributions from lobbyists or from the utilities that the PUC regulates.
Let him continue, please.
And I'm proud to say that I'm the grandson of George and Eleanor McGovern, and his legacy of public service in South Dakota is one of the reasons that I went to law school, so that I could work for people. And it's one of the reasons I've taken on some tough cases to represent people who found themselves in tough circumstances. And it's one of the reasons that I'm running for Public Utilities Commission this year, so I can work for consumers and farmers on the commission. This election this year is about a choice. It's a choice between a commissioner who's a very friendly person, but has unfortunately been a rubber stamp for the utilities. Or you can choose a commissioner who's going to ask tough questions when the utilities come in front of the PUC to ask for a rate hike. Someone who's going to ask tough questions about utility executives flying around in private jets that the ratepayers pay for. We've also seen a failure of the PUC to stand up for farmers in the bankruptcy of the Anderson Seed Company. And this scandal that cost farmers $2.6 million is something that the PUC needs to address. One thing we need to do is work with the legislature to fix our bankruptcy laws. Right now, when there's a bankruptcy, farmers are last in line. They're last in line to collect any scraps that are left over after the banks and everyone else has been paid. That's wrong, and that needs to change. We need to change our laws and do what they did in North Dakota, which is to put farmers first in line when there's a bankruptcy. And farmers there are considered owners of the product until they're paid for it. We also need commissioners who are going to stand up for the wind industry in South Dakota and all the new jobs that it's bringing here. I've been going around the state to see some of the success stories we have. Places like the molded fiberglass plant in Aberdeen, where there's 400 people making those giant wind turbine blades that you see on the backs of trucks on the highway. I saw 3 of them on my way here near Mitchell. Mitchell is also home to the wind energy training program at Mitchell Tech, where their students are making $40,000 a year to start right out of tech school. And I think the type of campaign you run shows what kind of elected official you're going to be. And I've been getting out to meet as many people as I can, getting out to introduce myself to voters and hear directly from voters what they want from their elected officials in Pierre. That's one of the best things about being at the fair here today. And I'm looking forward to your questions this afternoon.
All right, very good. Thank you. The first question that we will go with, and again, candidates, you'll have 2 minutes to answer the question. We will start with Mr. Nick Nemec. What will you do as a PUC commissioner to throttle back EPA regulations on coal, which has stifled energy production at South Dakota plants?
Rather than pull back on EPA regulations, I think we need to concentrate in South Dakota on renewable energy, getting more wind energy and solar energy, which solar energy is almost completely untapped in the state of South Dakota. And as you can see today, sunny day, imagine the amount of electricity we could be producing. So we need to concentrate on newer renewable forms of energy to develop within the state of South Dakota, and that is the way of the future. The coal industry is going to be priced out of existence, not so much from EPA regulations, but from the fact that currently there's a glut of natural gas in our country. With North Dakota oil fields coming on and natural gas fields in other parts of the country, the price of natural gas has continued to drop, and any new power plants that come online in the future are going to be gas-fired plants, which are, number one, they're cleaner, they're more efficient, they're more responsive than a coal-fired plant is. And so the coal industry is going to be in the future years, and for the foreseeable future, is going to be on a slow, steady decline anyway, and we should not be worried about defending the coal industry, but rather promoting cleaner forms of energy that are safer for our environment and better for the consumers and the landowners in South Dakota.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe just a little bit of background as to how we've gotten to this point. Barack Obama, when he was campaigning for president, flat out said that he was going to use EPA regulations to bankrupt the coal industry. And when he was talking about that, he was talking primarily about greenhouse gas regulations, which heretofore haven't happened. They're working on that, but the EPA has implemented and is in the process of implementing a whole series of other regulations on coal-fired power plants, things dealing with mercury, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulates, cooling water, and the ash left over after coal is burned. The restrictions are having the effect today of closing down 20 to 25% of the coal-fired power plants in this country. And when you consider that baseload coal is one of the cheapest forms of electricity, it doesn't take a rocket science economist to understand that something's going to have to go up, and that's the price of electricity. In South Dakota, 2 things are happening. First of all, The Big Stone coal-fired power plant in South Dakota, under these new regulations, is having to put in $490 million worth of pollution control equipment in a very short amount of time. Somebody's paying for that, and that's you. On the other end of the state, Black Hills Power, yesterday, closed down the Ben French coal-fired power plant and is building a brand new plant to replace that. Somebody's paying for that, and that is the consumers of Black Hills Power. And so the effect of these regulations, particularly the speed with which these regulations are being implemented, are driving up the cost for electricity consumers. Now, last week there was good news. The Federal Appeals Court finally said to one of these rules, EPA, you've gone far enough. You've gone past what Congress allows, and we're throwing it out.
Thank you. Again, same question over here to the left. Okay. What will you do as a PUC commissioner to throttle back the EPA regulations on coal, which has stifled energy production in plants in South Dakota? We will start with Russell Clark.
As libertarian, we want less government involvement in what we do. On the other hand, unfortunately, when we have coal power plants and they're polluting and they're destroying lands and rivers that we all use, something has to be done to stop that. We want the market to do it, and we want less regulation for the coal plants, but we want the courts to take care of when they do ruin things, when they do destroy things, so they'll have to pay for it and you won't have to pay for it. That's the whole principle of libertarianism, is that you, the people, will determine whether these plants are in your best interest or their own best interest. And so I would work as hard as I could to push back the regulations that the EPA is pushing forward. But I would also like to hear from the people to see how these regulations are either helping or hurting them before we do anything too rash. We want to make sure that everyone in this state will be served by what we are doing.
Thank you. Chrissy Fegan.
First of all, in South Dakota, we want to make sure that we protect the pocketbooks of farmers and ranchers, and we protect the pocketbooks of our families that are just trying to make ends meet and get food on the table. And when the EPA continues to send regulations to our coal fire plant, and actually I was just talking to a person that combines, custom combines yesterday, and he was telling me how expensive it is for a combine. And he looked at me and he said, it's because of some of those EPA regulations that are happening, and they have to put new types of systems on our combines to make sure the diesel is not having emissions to a certain level. And so we have to be careful, but we want to protect our earth. We want to make sure that we have and leave our world to our grandchildren and our children in a great way. So we have to make sure that renewables are continuing to be part of our portfolio. But on one of our highest days in June, and when we needed wind, it was only 7% of capacity at that time. So we have to depend on coal fire. So as an advocate for consumers, I want to make sure the EPA hears from South Dakota to say these regulations have to be reasonable. The emissions regulations and the levels have to be reasonable so that we can still use domestic energy for the importance and the pocketbooks of South Dakota. So we all have to work together to make sure that we're ready for our future with renewables, but we still have a great base load, and that we use domestic energy in America to make sure that we don't affect the pocketbooks of South Dakotans.
Thank you. And lastly, Matt McGovern.
Well, I don't agree with everything the EPA does. I wasn't happy when I found out that they were sending airplanes over feedlots to do surveillance and try and find people violating the Clean Water Act. That was really heavy-handed, and we don't need that here in South Dakota. And on the question about the new mercury regulations, I remember when these first came out, and Commissioner Gary Hansen, who's a Republican, has been on the PUC for about 10 years now, said that they were 20 years overdue and that we should have done it a long time ago. And I think that that's in part because it keeps poisonous mercury out of the air we breathe and the water we drink. It's also important to recognize too that in South Dakota, I thought this question might come up today, so I looked at the coal industry's website, and they are a little bit biased towards coal, but they said in South Dakota it's only providing 22% of our energy, and we're getting most of it from hydroelectricity. Commissioner Fegan and Commissioner Nelson and I were just at the brand new state-of-the-art, highly efficient natural gas plant in Brookings County that Basin Electric built, and we should be proud of that new facility here in South Dakota, because the price of gas has dropped greatly, and natural gas is actually cheaper than coal right now, and it works really well with wind energy because you can turn that on when the wind's not blowing. So the other thing too is that the commissioners, they're not members of Congress, they're not senators, they're not the president, and they really need to focus on what we can do in Pierre to help consumers and farmers, because when they get caught up too much in what's going on in Washington, D.C., it means that they're taking their eye off the ball and not looking out for consumers and farmers in South Dakota.
Okay, thank you very much. One rebuttal, quickly, 30 seconds.
Just to make sure you understand the difference between consume and use and generate, in South Dakota, we consume between 60 and 70% of energy from coal fire. Now, we don't produce that. We consume, we produce a lot of hydro, but we consume a lot of coal.
Okay, thank you. One last rebuttal.
It's what the coal industry and the Energy Information Agency say. It's that the energy that we use in South Dakota, that just 21% is from coal, and that's right here, and feel free to look at their website.
Okay, thank you. Next question, we will begin over here to the left with Christy Fegan. South Dakota is one of 4 states without a net metering law. Would you support the passage of a net metering law in the legislature?
Thank you. Net metering laws are very interesting because a person would like to put up a wind generator, and wind generators are very expensive to put up in your home to use. And so normally it's somebody that has some extra money to invest in a wind generator. But you have to be careful between retail net metering and wholesale net metering. When you have retail net metering and where that person that is producing wind energy and has the opportunity for net metering, if they have retail, then all of us are helping pay the transmission cost. All of us, all the rest of the consumers, are helping pay the administration costs. So sometimes when the legislators look at that in Pierre, they look at who's really going to pay for that net metering costs. And so that's what legislators in South Dakota look at, is do we want to send over another cost to consumers that don't get the advantage of net metering, and for somebody that put up a tower or has solar, or if we want to make sure that the person that invests in that actually is getting like a wholesale cost. So net metering is wholesale and retail, and I would not support retail net metering.
Matt McGovern.
I'm in favor of net metering. I realize a lot of the co-ops are not, and that's because there's some states that have probably gone a little bit too far with it, but I think as long as it's designed in a way that the co-ops can live with, I'm in favor of it, because it will lead to more production of clean energy right here in South Dakota. It'll put people to work putting solar panels up on roofs, putting up new little smaller scale wind turbines. That creates really good jobs for people working construction, or roofers, or electricians, and it can be done in a way that's fair and low cost too, because the price of solar energy and the price of wind energy have really dropped a lot in the last year or two, and I think it's something that the legislature should look at. And the other thing too, especially when you're talking about solar panels, putting them up on a barn or a business or your home, those are providing power at the most expensive times of the day, those hot sunny days when the wind might not even be blowing. And so when we're talking about the costs and benefits of it, we should also be looking at what time that's being generated, because the price is really getting to be a lot more favorable for clean renewable energy that we can make right here in South Dakota instead of relying on energy sources that are coming from out of state.
Thank you. Mr. Clark?
Net metering would be something that the legislature would have to look at, and as a public utility commissioner, I would probably say let the market decide. If there is a market for this, if it is going to save us an immense amount of money, if it is going to generate the amount of energy that we need, then it will pay for itself.
Okay, thank you very much. Same question over here. We'll start with Chris Nelson. South Dakota is one of only 4 states without a net metering law. Would you support the passage of a net metering law in the legislature?
I think first of all we have to understand there are different definitions of net metering, but the one that I'm going to address is the definition that's in federal law, and that essentially says that if you are a private generator, you can offset the amount of electricity that you consume in a billing period with the amount of electricity that you put back into the grid during that same billing period. That's retail net metering, and that's the definition in federal law, and I do not support South Dakota implementing that. And here's the reason why. I want to give you an example of this. If Zach puts up a tower, wind tower, and in that month, that tower generates 1,000 kilowatt hours of energy and puts it into the grid. And during that same month, his home consumes 1,000 kilowatt hours of energy. His bill under the federal definition of net metering to the electric company at the end of that month would be 0, unless there's a facility charge. And because of that, all of the costs that are incurred for the electric infrastructure to provide electricity to his home end up being picked up by all of us. And it's a shifting of costs, and so I do not support changing that. Now here's what we have to understand though, and a lot of people have come to me and said, well, we don't have net metering in South Dakota, therefore I can't put up a wind tower and have somebody buy my electricity. And that's a different story. Law allows you to put up a wind tower and requires your utility to buy that electricity. You can do that. That is the deal today, and I don't support changing that. You ought to have that right. But when you sell that electricity to the utility company, it's not going to be at the full retail rate.
Thank you. And Nick Memick. Speak, please.
What it comes down to on the net metering is what price this electricity that you generate is what you're going to receive for that if you put it back on the grid. Some of the power companies would want you to be paid what they call avoided cost, and that's the cost that it would cost them. It costs them at their, whatever kind of power plant mix they have right now, and people that are strong advocates of net metering wanted to simply roll their meter back at, and then they would get paid at whatever the retail rate is that they pay. So it's the wholesale versus retail cost difference there. Now, one thing I would support is, rather than the avoided costs, the current avoided costs of the power plants, since any windmill that goes up is a new source of energy, I would support that they would be paid at whatever the new avoided cost would be. So if, in other words, if a power company had to build new power plants, which we all know would be more expensive to build per kilowatt hour than old power plants, that if you put up a wind tower, you would be paid at whatever the PUC determined the new rate would be. So we would split the difference, if you would, between the wholesale and the retail rate on this power, and hopefully we would, everybody get half a loaf, nobody gets a whole loaf, but nobody gets screwed either.
All right, thank you very much. Next question, and for that we will start with Chris Nelson. How can you, as a member of the Public Utilities Commission, ensure grain producers are adequately protected in the event of a grain buying company's failure?
Thank you, and I appreciate that question. We knew we were going to be spending some time visiting about that today, and that's one of the reasons that after we went through the Anderson issue, that the PUC looked at what did we not have at our disposal that would have allowed us to catch that problem and prevent what ultimately happened there. And so we released in June a 5-point plan that we were going to ask the legislature to adopt that would give us the tools to find these kinds of problems quicker. And essentially what we're going to ask the legislature to do is give us the authority to request current financial information when a grain buyer is up for licensing. Secondly, we are going to ask the legislature to make sure that that information is provided under penalty of perjury. So if a grain buyer is lying to us, to the PUC on their financials, that there's a criminal penalty associated. We're going to ask that if a grain buyer moves into a position that would prevent them from being licensed, in other words, negative net worth, negative working capital, one of those kind of situations, they are going to be required to notify the Public Utilities Commission when that happens, and if they don't, they will have committed a crime. And then we are also asking that if you are a grain buyer that's domiciled outside of South Dakota, which was the Anderson situation, that they have to provide, at the PUC's request, their financial information within South Dakota so that we have the ability to get at that. And lastly, we're going to ask that, and currently the bond levels are set in statute. We're going to ask that those bond levels be adjusted and what I'm calling right size, narrow the categories. And let me tell you just, and I don't have much time, but as I was visiting with a grain buyer about these proposals, and I came to the one about if you move into a negative situation and you don't...
Mr. Henry?
All the proposals that Chris talked about, I can support. The one of his proposals that possibly I have a problem with is as he calls it, the right sizing of the bonding levels, and quite frankly, we're just fiddling around on the edges there. There's no way you can get sufficient bonding to cover the kind of losses that they experienced up at Redfield. The most important protection that we can have for farmers in these kind of instances is to pass a state law that a farmer owns his grain until he gets the check, and that check clears. And if If we put farmers at the front of the line, currently bankers are first and farmers are last. If we put the farmers first in line so that they own their grain until they get paid for it, that'll take care of a lot of the problem. And then after that can come the bankers and the electricians or anybody else that has a lien on that facility. The other thing we can do is implement that checkoff that I was talking about in my opening remarks, that if there are farmers that are, even after the farmer's been put first, and if there's still not enough money to make those farmers whole, we can, at very little pain to the rest of the farmers in the state of South Dakota, we can implement a temporary checkoff to raise enough money to come up with the shortfall and make those farmers whole. I tell you, it's just the South Dakota way. If your neighbor is in trouble, you go and help them. You put your work aside and you go and help your neighbor. That's the way it is, that's the way it has always been, and that's the way it should be.
Thank you. 30-second rebuttal, Chris Mills.
I think the only thing that I'd like to point out, when Nick talks about making a change in our title laws to allow the producer to retain title to that grain, today, when you dump a load of grain for sale, the title transfers to the elevator, and what does that allow the elevator to do? It allows them to resell that grain at whatever point is most beneficial for the elevator, and frequently that's going to happen very, very quickly. And I've talked to grain elevators about this particular proposal, and they said it would turn on a head how we normally do business. And before we jump on that bandwagon,
we'll move the question over here. We'll begin with Matt McGovern. The question again: how can you, as a member of the Public Utilities Commission, ensure grain producers are adequately protected in the event of a grain buying company's failure?
Well, the 5-point plan that was proposed after the debacle at Redfield, after farmers lost $2.6 million, there's some nice ideas in there, but it was just too little, too late. And the main thing that we got to do is, like Nick was saying, change our bankruptcy laws so that farmers come first in line. And I've heard a lot of negative comments and say, well, that would just never work here. And it's worked pretty well in North Dakota. It's worked well in Ohio and other states that have a really strong agricultural economy as well. And I think our legislature should look at that. And right now, having farmers come last and just take whatever's left over after the banks have been paid, that's just wrong, and we got to change that. And it's just it's just not acceptable the way it happened. And there's other things that could be done right now, in just letting people know what bonding levels each facility has, and having a $100,000 bond for $2.6 million worth of grain, not even close to being adequate protection. And I think if people were aware and knew what they were getting into, they might be able to pick another place that had a better financial track record. And there were also people in Pierre that saw that this company was in trouble. The Economic Development Fund was getting ready to make a loan, and because they saw the books and saw that the company was in trouble, they didn't make the loan, which is good news for taxpayers, but nobody could share that information with the farmers, and that's because of the confidentiality laws. So we need to address that as well and make sure that farmers have the same access to information that anybody else has, and then they can choose which facility to use and be protected.
Thank you. Christy Fegan.
First of all, in South Dakota, we do want to make sure we protect our farmers. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my dad in the drought of '76. And he bought me a little red motorcycle to herd the cows in the road ditches, because we didn't have enough hay. And a lot of times there's crises and uncertainties with farmers. And that's not fun. And absolutely, Redfield was not fun. We want to make sure that we work with producers and industry people to make sure it's preventive. So in 2008 and 2009, the legislature actually worked, and they brought grain buyers in for the very first time, where they were certified, that they were renewed and looked at, their books were looked at. They weren't looked at before. Ethanol plants weren't looked at. So farmers came to the table and were a blue ribbon committee, and this is the laws they put on the books. But does it go far enough? Probably not quite. So we need to continue to work on financial transparency, to make sure that we have industry people that are very good with farmers. We haven't had a bankruptcy for 10 years. We are so much better than North Dakota and South Dakota and Minnesota and Iowa. They've had like 7 in the last 10 years. And actually in North Dakota, Mr. McGovern, when you talk about the grain title and grain buyers, the farmers do keep the title, but as soon as it's sold, they lose the title. Or as soon as a grain is processed, they lose the title at an ethanol plant. So they don't keep the title the whole time, actually. So we want to make sure that we continue to protect farmers. We do it in a reasonable way that doesn't cost the pocketbooks of farmers in South Dakota.
And Russell Clark.
One of my favorite sayings is, light is the best disinfectant there is. And what really we need to do is have the financials available. Everyone has to be able to see them. We're trying to fix a problem that's already occurred. In other words, we're trying to save those farmers right now. Well, that can't happen. And so what we've got to do is look at the root of the problem. And if the root of the problem is that we don't know what's going on, we don't know what the financials of these companies are, we don't know their business, then if they're going to do business in South Dakota, we want to see it. We want it published. We want it on websites. We want farmers and everyone to be able to see it and make their own decisions.
Thank you very much. Next question, and you can keep the mic there, Russ, as you're the next one up here. What do you see in the future for more South Dakota wind projects like Wessington Springs, and how many more projects?
We are a fairly windy state, and so it would be wonderful if more companies got involved, if more individuals got involved, if we were able to tap wind for energy and make it as cost effective as we can. As a PUC, as a government, it's not our job to do these things. We have to get the businesses. We have to bring those businesses in. We have to convince people to start those businesses. We have to convince individuals to put up those turbines. We have to do those things, but as far as legislating it, as far as dictating it, no, we can't. We have to help people understand the value in it, and that's what we would do.
Thank you. Christy Fegan.
Thank you. First of all, when the article came out that South Dakota is the highest at 22% of what we generate in the South Dakota, that makes us all proud. because that means that we're looking at renewables and that we're doing the research to make sure that when we have the research to have batteries that we can store it, we're in the forefront. But we have to make sure right now it's affordable also. So as we continue to build wind projects and create jobs, and we also have to look at Washington, because they have the production tax credits that is still on the table. And if we don't have production tax credits, which is 1/3 of the cost of wind energy and saves us 1/3 of the cost, then it's going to be hard to put up new wind farms. But wind farms are good for South Dakota. We have a great generation. We're getting new transmission lines that actually go from Brookings to Minnesota that will help us transport this wind, because we generate a lot of wind in South Dakota, but we export a lot of wind across the nation. So we're an exporter state of wind. We have great wind, as you already know, in South Dakota. We need to keep on doing research that we can use renewable energy in the future as we go forward, and it's great to have in our portfolio.
Thank you. And Matt McGovern.
Well, this is one area where Congress really needs to act. The production tax credit for wind energy is set to expire, and it's something that's been renewed year after year, going back about 20 years through both Democratic and Republican administrations, Democratic and Republican Congresses. So that's something that we need. We really need that in South Dakota, because we've got jobs all over the state that rely on that. Like I mentioned before, that plant in Aberdeen that makes the wind turbine blades, and the graduates from Mitchell Tech that are finding great paying jobs from the new jobs that wind energy is bringing to South Dakota. And so our Congress really needs to act. And the PUC also has a role too in making sure that they're doing what they can to get wind energy projects approved and clean up some of the red tape that's led to projects either be delayed or canceled in South Dakota. And we are on our way to getting some transmission brought to Brookings County. There's 2 major transmission lines that are going to come into Brookings County. I think as a result of that, we're going to see a lot more wind energy in South Dakota. And that's something that we can all be proud of, and hopefully Congress will act in time to get it done and make sure we don't see layoffs in Aberdeen, and so that we don't see students graduating from Mitchell Tech without an ability to find a job in the wind industry that they've been trained in.
Okay, thank you very much. Same question moved over here. Mr. Nemec, you will begin. What do you see as the future for more South Dakota wind projects like in Wessington Springs, and how many more wind projects?
I foresee a future in South Dakota where wind will become more and more important. I'm not going to hazard a guess on how many projects might become available, but as the candidates on the other side of the podium there talked about, a big issue on whether or not wind becomes more prevalent is the production tax credit on the federal level. This has been kind of every year it's batted around, and it's on a year-to-year basis. And that puts a lot of uncertainty into that industry. It should be adopted on a permanent basis so that will give some stability to that new industry, that wind energy industry. Now, some people will claim that we shouldn't be subsidizing an industry like that. But I would argue that for years and years, our country has been subsidizing the oil industry by defending the Straits of Hormuz, by having military all across the world to assure an adequate supply of oil to the United States. So don't kid yourself. Some of these other industries are also receiving subsidies. It's just not quite as direct a subsidy as the production tax credit, but it's a subsidy nonetheless to help ensure a flow of oil around the world. And not only are we subsidizing that for the United States, where in fact U.S. taxpayers are subsidizing that flow of oil for every citizen of the world. We need to continue that production tax credit. It needs to be made permanent by Congress, and I would hope that whoever's elected to these positions would lobby Congress to help ensure that is a permanent tax credit.
Thank you. And Chris Nelson.
I think in answering this question, I have to re-emphasize what Commissioner Fegan began with, and that's the fact that in South Dakota, 22% of the electricity generated comes from wind. That ranks #1 in this nation. We have made good progress in this area. But having said that, we've only begun to tap the potential that is out there in wind. Do I see a lot of development over the next couple of years in South Dakota? The answer is no, for one very simple reason. We produce more electricity in this state than we consume, and we've got to have buyers for that electricity and ways to get it out of South Dakota. As has been mentioned, a new transmission line is being planned from the White, South Dakota area to the Twin Cities, another line from Big Stone coming down to White, and a third line from Ellendale, North Dakota coming over to Big Stone. That's the grid that's being planned and put together that will allow continued development of wind energy and allow those developers to find buyers to the east where they can pay for that electricity and we can get it out of this state. I think the most poignant thing that I can tell you to try to picture the difficulty that we're having with wind and getting it out of South Dakota today is what happened last summer. As our Missouri River dams were running full speed because of the water that we had, we were literally shutting down windmills in South Dakota. They were turning them off, not because we didn't have wind, but because there was so much electricity here and we couldn't get it out of South Dakota. I've got to address the comment about red tape from the PUC. There is none. When a company comes to us for a siting permit of a project or a power line, we move that through very, very quickly. There's no evidence that those have been held up.
Thank you very much, and I believe we have time for one more question here. Before we, and again, thanks to all of you for all of your questions. Final question, and we will begin with Mr. Nemec. What is the status of smart meters for, I believe, home and industrial electric use in South Dakota?
A smart meter is something that in fact, that there are smart meters out there right now. In my house, and we've lived in our house for 12 years now, we in effect have a smart meter. It's hooked up to our water heater in our house, and what it does is when the electric company senses peak load, they shut off our electric water heater, and so we're not drawing on the grid at that time, so it lowers their peak. And to be honest with you, we've never noticed when that thing shuts on or off. It's just a non-issue. So there's been technologies out there for a long time to help with peak metering. Now, also there's other smart meters that detect when you're using more electricity at an absolute peak area or peak time, and that's new technology that we need to encourage power companies to adopt that technology. It's something that is not widely in effect right now, but we need to encourage that technology to be adopted, and I would support that sort of technology, because then the power companies could more accurately bill people for someone who's using electricity at the peak part of the day versus putting off use of electricity for nighttime use when the cost to the power companies drop, and smart meters would facilitate that, and I would support the more widespread use of smart meters to be used in that fashion.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson.
I would agree with everything that Nick has said in this regard. There's a lot of different kinds of smart meters. Some simply send a signal back to the utility company to indicate how much electricity has been used during the month, and others are sending a lot more information back that allows the utility company to more efficiently manage their grid and their generation resources. And then the next step on that is smart meters that feed information back to the utility company, which in turn feeds it back to you via the internet to allow you to understand your energy consumption patterns. Utility companies are now taking that one step further. Black Hills Electric is an example of that, where they are going to experiment with time of use metering. In other words, when the utility company is buying a kilowatt hour of wholesale electricity at a peak situation, day like today when it's pretty hot, that's an expensive unit of electricity versus that unit of electricity they're buying in the middle of the night. But when you pay for it, you're paying the same amount. And so what some utility companies are experimenting with is giving you a varied rate, a cheaper rate at night, a higher rate during peak hours, and allowing you to use that smart meter to monitor your particular consumption, and if you choose to move some of your consumption to those cheaper hours, thereby saving you some dollars. And so I think that's That's exciting. It's in the future and has the potential for saving fuel resources and saving dollars in consumers' pockets, and a lot of potential there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over here to the left, we will begin with Christy Fegan, and the question again, what is the status of smart meters for home and industrial electrical use in South Dakota?
As we all know, when we read in the papers, it is expanding across the state with our utilities, our investor-owned utilities, and our rural cooperatives. And you've heard a lot about smart meters, but I actually want to go to energy efficiency, because that's part of what smart meters do. And when we control our energy, we actually control our demand, and then maybe we won't have to have that next brand new power plant that's going to cost us $1 billion or $1.5 billion, or we could back it off for a few years. So it's very important that we also, when we look at smart meters, we don't forget our programs of energy efficiency. Actually, the Department of Energy just sent a memo in March, and here another regulation goes from the Department of Energy and the Federal Administration. And actually this time they're going after WAPA, which is the one that control our hydro in the Great Plains and absolutely in South Dakota. And they want to preempt the South Dakota PUC from looking at energy type of efficiency programs. We look at them and we approve them. Now they want to do that in Washington. And what I say about Washington is no. I don't want our decisions made in Washington about energy efficiency programs in South Dakota. I would rather have us look at them to make sure they're affordable, they're reasonable, and they're impacting all consumers in a positive way.
Thank you very much. Matt McGovern.
Well, like the commissioners have said, they're kind of rolling out in South Dakota. We're getting more and more of them, and they really have tremendous potential. And the more information that we can have, the better quality, the better the technology gets. It's just going to give more information to consumers and help consumers save money on their bills. And some of these demonstration projects are really cool. Some of them can even get down to the level of, it'll tell you on your computer exactly how much each thing in your house that's plugged in costs you. And so people that have picked these up in demonstration projects have been able to see, just how much their refrigerator cost them. And that old refrigerator, they never realized how much it was costing them. And the new ones are much cheaper and much more efficient. So the more we can do here in South Dakota to roll them out, the better. And there's some of the utilities here, Black Hills Power, I know, has rolled some of them out using some funding from the federal government. And I hope that the PUC will continue to work to get more funding for these meters and encourage the utilities to use them and focus on what we can do here in Pierre to help South Dakotans get access to these smart meters, because it can help us all save a lot of money.
All right, and Russell Clark.
There's been an enormous amount of consensus about smart meters, and I hate to be the one throwing water on it, so I'm not. Technology is always a good thing. It's always going to move us forward. It's always going to lower rates. The only thing I would say is we can't force it. We can't force people to change their meters. We can't force people out of older homes. We can't force people out of situations where maybe it's not as practical as a brand new house in a nice subdivision. So the PUC, its role really in this is recommendations. And of course everybody wants smart meters, everybody wants electricity at its best price, at its best time, and I would agree with that, but in no way would I allow the federal government or even the state government to determine to us what we should do. We have to make those decisions.
Very good, thank you very much. Before we get to the closing statements, how about a round of applause for our candidates? Thank you, guys. I wish we had some more time because there's plenty of questions up here, but we have reached our time limit. We'll begin with 3 minutes for closing statements. We'll start over here, and we'll begin in the opposite order of opening statements, and that would lead us to Mr. Matt McGovern.
Well, thanks everyone today. Thanks for your questions. And it's been good to get some questions from the moderator and also from you guys. It's one of the best things about coming to the fair. And like I said in my opening, the kind of campaign that you run gives a pretty good indication of what kind of elected official you're going to be. And my campaign is not funded by lobbyists. It's not funded by the utilities the PUC regulates. And I've been instead focusing on getting out as much as I can to meet directly with voters so I can hear from voters about what the voters want from their elected officials in Pierre. And so I've been getting out as much as I can, and people, wherever I go, people ask me, what can the PUC do to make sure that we never have another scandal like the Anderson Seed Company bankruptcy that cost farmers $2.6 million. I get questions about what can we do to help landowners protect their property rights from the proposed pipeline, the proposed Keystone XL pipeline, and we've got some of the landowners here today I recognize out in the audience. And that's something that comes up a lot when I'm out on the campaign trail. The main thing that people mention to me is that they say that their electric bills have gone up too much. And so that's something that we're all in favor of working to protect consumers. And if I'm elected, I'm gonna protect consumers and farmers. My roots in South Dakota run deep, and I should recognize that today my grandfather George McGovern is here, sitting up front. And this is not our first time together at the state fair. The first time was in 1980 during his Senate re-election campaign, and I came here to see him speak to a huge crowd of people, similar to the Farmers Union Day here at the state fair, and it was just great to see him speak at such a big crowd. My grandma grew up near here in Woonsocket. She grew up on a farm, and years later I followed my South Dakota roots to Rapid City after I finished law school, and I went to work for the federal district court there, and it was my job to take all the briefs and take all the evidence and take all the arguments from both sides of the case and do my own research and make a recommendation to the judge about what to do. So it really prepared me to sit on the Public Utilities Commission, because a commissioner has to act like a judge sometimes, and they need to be able to do their own research and ask tough questions when the utility comes in front of them to ask for a rate hike. They need to get a case right when a co-op is in a dispute with an investor-owned utility over territory, and they got to get it right because there's a lot of money at stake, and there's the investment at stake, there's everyone's electric bill at stake, and if it goes to court, it takes years to resolve. So this fall, we're getting closer to the election. You're going to have a choice between someone who's been a rubber stamp for the utilities or someone who's been able to ask tough questions. And if I'm elected, I'm going to work for consumers and farmers, and I need your vote this fall.
Thank you. Christy Fegan.
Thank you, first of all, for coming out. It's great to have everybody. It's great to be back at the fair. I feel like I get to show cattle maybe a little bit later, but instead I'm going to a wedding. First of all, I work with people across the state. I work with people all across in agriculture, in business, in small business, in consumers that really need to worry about their pocketbook. I work with Democrats and Republicans, but I always do what's right. That's who Christy Fegan is. Number one, I am a voice for the people, number one. And when Mr. McGovern talked about this jet service from the CEO that goes from Denver to Minnesota, you need to listen to the transcript of the PUC when we asked them, did you leave that in the rates or did you pull it out? And they pulled the majority out because we said we are not paying for a private jet service from Denver to Minneapolis so he can get to the corporate office. Also, they wanted a 9% increase, over a 9% increase, and actually they got a 5% increase. And their rate of return was 9.25 at the utilities. We were an advocate for you, the consumer. And actually, if you read the papers across the nation, they talk about the South Dakota PUC. And we have one of the lowest rate of returns in the country. So we are advocates for you. That's who we're advocates for. Number two, I want to make sure we have access to technology and that our broadband is expanded across the state. Because I have two young kids. They're 11 and 13. And I keep on telling Alex and Jackson I want them to live here when they grow up, because South Dakota is a great place to raise a family. And so we need to make sure the FCC doesn't put a stop on broadband technology and internet access, because in South Dakota, if you have high-speed internet, you can work for a company out of Chicago or New York or London and still live in South Dakota. So I want to make sure our citizens have high-speed internet across the state, and that the FCC doesn't over-regulate our rural telephone cooperatives. And number three, I will continue to be common sense of the EPA. I want to make sure we have that base load, that we keep the lights on, and that we have common sense. Just like when farmers have the issue with dust and EPA, Well, we also have some issues. We want clean energy, but it has came at such a short time frame that we have liability issues on stake. So that's the issue with the EPA. So I want to continue to be a voice for consumers. I want to continue to be an advocate for technology across the state, that we have access to technology. And number 3, that we have common sense in regulation, and that we don't over-regulate and cost families and farmers a lot more money. So I would appreciate your vote in November.
Thank you. And, okay, let's give Russ his time. Russell Clark.
I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out. It is really wonderful to see so many people who are interested in the issues that affect us. As far as telecommunications, energy, farming, grain, it's just really, really nice to see that. Having said that, you see 4 to 5, I include myself in this, qualified candidates, and you're going to have to make your decisions based on what we said here today and what you find out. And what I recommend you do is visit the different candidates' website. Visit the PUC website at sd.puc.gov. I hope I got that right. Did I get that right? I got it right. And also another website I recommend for you is isidewith.com. It asks you some questions about your political beliefs and then recommends candidates at the national and state level for you. So I recommend you do that as well. A million years ago, when we lived in a different place, well, it wasn't a million years ago, it just seems that way, we lived in Indiana, my wife and I, with our small young son. And we didn't enjoy it as much as we enjoy it here, but we both taught school, and we both taught classical languages and literature, dead languages, Latin and Greek. And when we moved to South Dakota, I realized that, yeah, nobody wants to know about dead languages anymore. What they want to do is technology, and so I joined a computer firm, and I learned technology. And I understood it as so much that starting with no knowledge, I was able to teach other people how computers work, how computers function, and then moved into the sales area to teach them how to sell them as well. So I am a quick learner, I am a fast learner. I don't have the amount of knowledge that the people up here have, but I will get it if I am elected. Thank you.
Thank you. We will move over here to my right. Closing statements, 3 minutes. We begin with Chris Nelson.
Thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out here today, because this is the deal. You are the boss. You are going to hire one of us to be your PUC commissioner for the next 4 years. And I'd like to close by just telling you the 3 things that I believe I bring to this table, things in my background. And the first of those is a demonstrated track record of making judicial decisions with impartiality and fairness. You know, all the questions today have revolved around policy, but in fact, 70% of what the PUC does are making judicial decisions. Disputes between consumers and utility companies, disputes between utility companies, requests for rate increases from utility companies. We deal with those in a judicial manner, and it's important to take the facts of each of those cases and the law that applies and make a decision based on the facts and the laws, and make that impartially. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a track record of doing that, not only at the PUC, but also when I was Secretary of State. The second thing that I bring to this is competent administration. You know, we've talked about policy today, but when policy is passed by the legislature, and we've had some talk about perhaps implementing an indemnity fund. If the legislature chooses to do that, you need competent administrators at the PUC to make sure that that fund is implemented properly. I have a demonstrated track record of competent administration. I bring that to the table. And the last thing that I bring, and then perhaps the most important, I have a passion for working for you, a passion for working for the people of South Dakota, for the utility consumers of this state, and making sure that you are taken care of in front of the PUC. As I begin, I mentioned that we have challenges in the utility area. We have challenges in the area of grain buyers and grain warehouses. Over the last year and a half, I've had a tremendous privilege to get my feet wet working on those challenges, acquainting myself with the field of information. And let me tell you, the technology involved here and the law involved here is deep. It's complicated. But that excites me, and I believe that I've given myself a good background to continue working for you in that regard and making sure that you, the consumers of South Dakota, are well represented on your Public Utilities Commission. Thank you.
Thank you. And 3 minutes for Mr. Nick Demick and your closing thoughts.
I would just like to say that my 29 years experience as a farmer in South Dakota has given me the ability to make important decisions. I've worked the land for 29 years. I've fought Mother Nature. Sometimes we worked hand in hand. Sometimes I fought Mother Nature, and I paid every bill all along the way. And that's to manage an operation like that. When I started 29 years ago, I had enough cash, and I bought 20 bred heifers, and we built up a farm from that, all to the sweat of my brow, and the help of my family, and we've made I've got a demonstrated track record of being able to make important decisions for the betterment of my family and for the advancement of my family. That's the same ability that I would put to use if I was on the Public Utilities Commission, to make decisions for the betterment of the people of the state of South Dakota, to ensure that the citizens of the state of South Dakota were treated fairly by the corporations that the Public Utilities Commission regulates. I would argue that the way that the current laws are set up for instance, in the grain warehouse field, that the playing table is slanted down toward those grain warehouses and against the farmers. And I would argue that if it's set up that way in that area, there's a possibility that that playing table and those regulations are slanted towards the other corporations that the Public Utilities Commission regulates. And so I would work to level that playing field so that all the citizens of the state of South Dakota would get a fair shake when it came to the issues that the Public Utilities Commission regulates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Also a thank you here before we wrap up to the South Dakota Rural Electric Association and South Dakota Farmers Union for helping sponsor today's Public Utilities Commission candidate debate. A thank you to all of our candidates on both sides, and a thank you to you for your questions and for being here to listen to what these individuals have to say. You're deciding their future in November. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day at the South Dakota State Fair.